Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I want to thank Ben from Uncharted X for coming to talk with us today. I'm giddy with excitement. I've been wanting to chat with you for a while. I've been watching your videos now for quite a while, and I really wanted to. I know you're sort of focused right now, and I want to talk about precision and sort of what we're figuring out right now.
Sure.
Yeah, and so you've been working on with a couple other guys on this Vase project.
Yeah, Vase Scan Project. I wouldn't describe. I mean, I'm working with, and I'm kind of documenting what they're doing. I can't claim. I mean, I'm not a metrologist or a machinist or anything, but they. So I was originally contacted by Chris Dunn because it was his son Alex who. And in fact, you have to give credit to Adam Young. In fact, Adam is like the owner of what I'd call the OG vase, the original gangster / original granite vase, the kind of the subject of the first vase scan kind of project, the analysis, the work that Mark Viss later did. Mm-hmm. This is the thing that kind of cracked us open, and then it's since expanded to a whole bunch more artifacts. But Adam had been fascinated by these for years, and he's a man of means that could get his hands on some of these artifacts from the antiquities market. And he had this vase, and he'd been trying to, get it. And he was looking at the technology, and I think he traveled with Chris Dunn to Egypt when he was doing tours. And he met Alex on that trip. And turns out Alex is a metrologist also. He works in the aerospace industry.
Right.
And he uses a lot of these tools, particularly the GD&T tools, the geometric distancing and tolerancing, the stuff that because you can scan these things. Now we have technology to scan artifacts at a really high resolution. This is relatively new over the last, decade or so.
Right.
Things like structured light scanning, laser scanning. You've got also even high resolution tools now where you can do CT X-ray scanning, get resolution down to the micron kind of level. And then so he arranged to get that vase scanned, and then eventually it was Alex and his colleagues that did the initial analysis. And I know Chris was it's funny because Chris, I've been friends with Chris for a long time now, and he was a little skeptical of I'm not sure you're going to see anything. And then when these results came back and he saw them, he was kind of blown away by it.
Right.
And they were looking for a way to get the word out. And I think Chris suggested that he called me and said, "Is it all right if Alex calls you about this thing?" And so that's what happened. Eventually, Alex called me and I talked to him, and then I started getting involved. And this was serendipitous timing to some extent because this was a couple of months before I was supposed to go on Rogan for the first time. So we kind of got down the road a little bit by the time I'd got to that first podcast with him, which of course, massive audience. So I got to kind of put the word out. And ever since then, I've been probably the central point for documenting it, but by no means the only one. There's Matt Bell got involved. Like he's now doing his. I'm friends with Matt. He's bought a ton of vases. He's getting them all scanned. He's producing amazing content talking about it. It's gone in a lot of different directions since then. Like there's a lot of things going on. I haven't actually done an update to the Vase Scan project for some time, but it's definitely the wheels are in motion. Things are happening. But I think you're right. I mean, it's to me, and I think to a lot of people, it does seem to represent probably one of the more significant kind of leaps forward in terms of here's some concrete evidence that's very hard to dispute that suggests there's something really sophisticated going on, because these vases and the results we're seeing are just, incredibly challenging even today. And there have been, some modern attempts to replicate some of these now, even using, 3-axis CNC mill machines, and you're still looking at like a 10x decrease in precision and things like that. And we're not even talking about lug handles on the vase or any of these sophisticated aspects of it. There's a lot to get into when it comes to these vases.
Yeah. I was going to say, it felt like it was sort of the first thing that you could really put your hand on and go, okay, explain this. Like this doesn't make sense to the model that we're talking about. So how did this happen?
Well, yeah, I agree. It's the most concrete evidence, I think. Probably the most data that we've got, but we've known about I would say
Right.
we collectively, a lot of people, even going back to time of Flinders Petrie, the late 1800s, ever since, the whole concept of engineering as a science sort of emerged out of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
I mean, we've known about it, and even he was documenting things that were just remarkably and strangely precise, like beyond the capabilities of what he could see at the time, just based on, capabilities at the turn of the 19th or 20th century. Industrial Revolution technology. I mean, that's so there's been a lot of stuff, and he talked about it. And then, there's been various little bits and pieces here and there. People have looked at Serapeum boxes. Chris Dunn's done a lot of the work to, from an engineering perspective, I think, to move forward since Petrie. I mean, not a lot of other people have really taken the time and effort to try and analyze artifacts from a mechanical engineering perspective. And one of his books, he's probably better known for his Giza power plant theory, but he wrote another book after the first one called Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, which deals with a much broader range of machining topic. I find that to be extremely valuable because he literally went around and used the tools of the trade at the time, a lot of hand tools, like high expensive, precision tools, die gauges and corner radius gauges. And he was measuring things and looking at them and taking, front-on pictures and doing reverse transparency overlays and showing symmetry and precision, showing features in a lot of this stone architecture, like some of the granite blocks that you find up at the Giza Plateau that have features that are really only there because they were done in a, they'd be there if we tried to make them today. It's kind of these overcuts and these other features that are in the stone that are only happen as a result of a sort of sophisticated machining process and not somebody just banging on it with rocks and sticks and sand.
Right. I think you make in one of the videos you talk about like this mess up is weeks of work if we're talking about doing it the old way, that you don't mess up that bad.
Like overcuts and things. Yeah, I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, so
there's that like box lid that they missed the line and it
that's right.
Yeah.
It's in like a hidden corner in the Cairo Museum. We take everybody there to see it every time because it shows you the circular saw cuts that were being made to how they would saw the lid off the bottom of the block of stone, and it still has those cut marks in it. And it drifted off track, and so they kind of abandoned it. And then the lid snapped, like the piece that was cut kind of snapped. And I guess they just tossed that piece rather than reuse it, which is what you'd logically do if you're doing anything by hand. But I mean, all of those things. I mean, I broadly break it down into a couple different categories where I'm a little careful. I mean, I talk about the things that are interesting to me, but I am a little careful to say what I think is beyond kind of the capabilities of the known dynastic Egyptian civilization. I mean, I don't want to underestimate them. They did incredible works. They did incredible things, but the reality is they're still a Bronze Age civilization that used primitive tools and techniques. And we know this because we found the tools. We found the sort of things they use, pounding stones, dolerite pounding stones, flint, chisels, copper and bronze later on, tools that really don't have much effect on hard stone at all. And we also have scenes on the walls that show you what they were doing. Like they literally draw, they've got scenes of woodworking. They've got scenes of creating some of the alabaster vessels, the softer stone vessels, using sticks and stones and just manual labor. They have scenes that is in the tombs of the nobles on the West Bank at Luxor that show them making mud bricks, for example, and then constructing ramps out of mud brick or potentially the mud brick pyramid. So, we know we kind of have this. We know kind of what the capabilities were and what the tools they were using, and you really can't use those things to explain all of the artifacts and the work that we see. There's plenty of stuff that we can explain with that tech tool, with those tools and those techniques. So, when I'm looking at this stuff, it's like, okay, so there are a couple of characteristics that I think are beyond them. One is the machining marks. We were just getting into that. Things like overcuts, the tubular drill marks. So there's been a ton of work done, particularly looking at Petrie's core number 7, which is the core from one of those tubular drills. The markings on that, there are literally dozens and dozens of holes that should also be investigated in the same way. There's lots more cores for that matter as well that we could expand our knowledge on there. The circular saw marks, things like overcuts into hard stone you were talking about. I mean, you just wouldn't make overcuts if you're doing this stuff manually, because you'd literally have to be grinding away for hours and hours to make that mistake, versus something that's a bit more powerful. The marks themselves are indicative of tools that we've never found in the archaeological record, massive circular saws, very powerful tools. And so there's machining and tooling marks and witness marks in the stone. And then you've got precision. So the vases are part of that. The boxes where you have these extremely geometrically complex artifacts that are very hard to accomplish, typically made out of really hard types of stone. Things like symmetry is an aspect of precision. So when you see sort of exact symmetry, like you see in some of the big heads of the 400 or 500 ton statues, again, that's not something that is really achievable by hand. At least nobody's demonstrated it. And then the last category that I kind of really look at is logistics. So another thing we know about the dynastic Egyptians is we know how they move stuff. They show us. They weren't using pulleys. They weren't using the wheel in the Old Kingdom. They didn't have it. They were dragging things around on sleds using ropes and human horsepower. As far as we know, they never even used livestock or animals to provide horsepower to move stuff. So you're kind of limited in what you can achieve with that. They'd have levers and sleds and human horsepower, and these levers are made out of either copper or potentially wood. I think you can explain stuff that might be up to 100, 150 tons with enough people, enough manpower, with enough room. But I think that starts to become really challenging once you get above those numbers. And then, go look at the artifacts that are out there and the stone blocks that are out there. I mean, on the Giza Plateau, there's a stone block that weighs 450 tons. You've got the unfinished obelisk down there in the quarry that if it was cut from the bedrock and removed would have been nearly 1,200 tons. You've got a number, probably a handful, at least 4 or 5, evidence for at least 4 or 5 of these 1,000-ton statues. Like they range in scale from 100 tons, 50 tons, right up 300, 400, 500 tons, and then the biggest ones that are easily going to be over 1,000 tons. Single piece granite or quartzite statues. And some of these, there's one in particular that there's a foot of it. All that's left is this giant foot, this toe. And I can put my hand up, my outstretched hand doesn't fit inside the toenail. And it's granite. And then this granite, Tanis is up in the north, in the delta. The stone came from Aswan, which is in the south of Egypt. You're talking about 1,000 miles between those two locations. So there's this 1,000-ton statue that presumably was something probably around 1,500 tons at least as a block of stone, because we also know they didn't move stuff, or generally this stuff wasn't moved when it was finished. It was left with this protective layering of stone. It was finished on site, so somehow somebody moved a 1,000+ ton block of stone at more than 1,000 miles north, and stuff like that. But those are the 3 categories that kind of I do kind of look at in terms of this technological evidence for stonework and artifacts that are beyond the capabilities of what we know about the dynastic Egyptians. The vases are important. They're not giant. They're not these big things, but they absolutely show precision. Lots of them also show these tooling marks that we see. And the really interesting thing to me about the vases and why they're so important and why I think they help to show that there was something more sophisticated going on before the dynastic Egyptians is that there are many of these are incontrovertibly, and this isn't, it's not controversial at all, that they're pre-dynastic. They've been found in these pre-dynastic burials stretching back many thousands of years before the start of the dynastic civilization ever happened. And they go into the dynastic time. They peter out about the 3rd and 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. And even the ones that we found that come from those times, like Joseph's step pyramid at Saqqara, and he was a pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty, they found 40 to 50,000 of these vases beneath that step pyramid. Even then, they literally, it's a sign written on the wall in the Imhotep Museum at that place that he says many of these were, inherited heirlooms that came from earlier dynasties and earlier times, because they dug them up and they found that they had these crude inscriptions on them that had the names of these older kings and older rulers on them. So it seems clear he was collecting them and bearing them with him. And I think that's a tacit acknowledgement of this is actually what we're looking at, even potentially with the pre-dynastic people, the Nadak and Nadak II cultures, that were there before, what we call the dynastic Egyptians arose. They were likely also finding them because they also had no capability to make them. They were making clay pot vessels, and they were imitating them or painting them to look like these granite vessels. But there's nothing there that suggests they weren't also just finding them and understanding, all right, we're in the business of making these vessels and vases. We're probably already working in primitive forms of stone. You see this thing, you intrinsically understand its value, its significance. It becomes an important item, and the clan chief or the king or whoever it is going to want to be buried with it, and that's what happened. And the interesting thing is those vases, they die out, they stop about the third, fourth dynasty, and around the end of the fourth dynasty. All of the vases that were made in Egypt after that are these alabaster handmade vases, which are all explainable by primitive techniques, the scenes on the walls, the tools that we found. They're not precise. They don't have any of the same characteristics as the hard stone vases, which are made from granite, diorite. There's even ones with huge percentages of corundum in them, which is a 9 on the Mohs scale. And I think that's interesting. And so these vases have this link to the other types of architecture and artifacts, the bigger stuff, like the statues, the obelisks, the boxes, the slabs, the architecture. So in terms of the precision, the machining marks, you see, we have this, we can draw this link between them. But because these other things are so large, if it's a 400-ton statue, it's going to be on a site. You can't bury it with you. That site's going to be inherited, reused. The dynastic Egyptians are going to occupy it. And then over time and over thousands of years, particularly in the New Kingdom, these kings were now writing their names on them. They were hammering their names into them. And then that name that modern Egyptologists and archaeologists look at that, and they're going to date and relate that statue into the story of history based on what's written on it. But I just don't think that's like a conclusive evidence at all that's when it was made.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the Tale of Two Industries video the site in Toshka that's now flooded and covered over, but they found a burial with some of those pots in it.
Yeah.
Or the vases in it. And that site's dated at 14,000 and it's definitely not it's a primitive burial. So at that point you have to go okay, so how old are we really talking about here? If they were that advanced, and then it's all been essentially, we assume it's been lost at that point, and then now we're got a primitive burial at 14,000.
And Daniel was showing that image to me, and it jumped out before we started. You've got this very obviously rough, like handmade, vase in it, and then you have these precision ones, and I'm like, this is like finding somebody carrying a stone dagger and a musket at the same time. Obviously, something's not. Something is very discombobulated about this. If you're going to be like, they're exactly the same, because this guy could make this high-end modern rifle, but he only has the technology to make a stone knife.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I use Toshka as an example. People go after it because they're like, there's no actual, we can't find. There's not a lot of records about Toshka. We're going off the images. And there's definitely stone vessels in those images. In fact, I was the last trip in Egypt. We went to the what's it called? It's the Aswan Museum, Nubian Museum, and they have a big, extensive. It's in this weird area. It's like this temporary display area, but they have all these photographs of all these sites. Toshka being one of them. There's many sites. And we found a lot. I haven't done a video on it yet. I'm going to, but there's a lot of these sites where you can see these vessels, and these are all basically very old, as I said, Toshka was like, I think 14,500 years ago was and carbon dated to that. Lots of sites in that kind of time frame that were dug up and documented in the 60s, and then those sites have since been flooded because of the Aswan Dam.
Right.
And it's it's not. I think I use it as an outlier to show the potential time frame. I think it could be way older than that, but there's lots of also 100% non-controversial pre-dynastic sites where these vessels have come from. In fact, one of the ones in Adam's collection goes back to about 9,000-10,000 years ago, so 7,000-8,000 BC. That was given as a gift to the Czech ambassador, I think in the 1930s or something. And its provenance is established. Like these, and you go to the museum and you'll find these things all through the pre-dynastic sections where they're being displayed in cases next to literally stone stone beads and bone ornaments, and these really primitive, like Neolithic kind of artifacts. So yeah, I mean, but in terms of a time frame, I don't know. I mean, which you can't really date the stone, obviously.
Right.
I don't. It's a speculation that I'm reserving a little bit for this book that I'm writing, because I think I can. Well, no, I'll talk a bit about it. I can set enough context, I think, to then speculate a bit. But I'm not. I don't think it's simply 15,000 years old. This idea that, okay, this was a pre-Younger Dryas cataclysm culture that got wiped out by that cataclysm, and then there's a period of, several thousands years, and then a civilization reemerges. I think we're potentially talking about much longer time frames. I mean, tens of thousands of years before this, because there's lots of cataclysms. Like the Younger Dryas is one of the biggest ones, and it's the most recent one. But if you go back through the record before that, you've got the Bolling-Alerod period, you've got the Elder Dryas. There's all of these ups and downs where we know these were catastrophic kind of civilization-ending events. I think it's and you combine that with the kind of the modern research that's happening in adjacent fields of science in terms of genetics and looking at the human timeline, where now I think that the latest data is showing that we might be as old as 800,000 to 900,000 years old as a species. So I think that window, and now you're talking not just the last glacial maximum, but into other periods where it was a bit more temperate.
Right.
So all of that's is a possibility. Just the surface of the Earth is entirely different now than what it was then. So yeah, I kind of I don't pin myself down to just this was all ended by the Younger Dryas. I think it's potentially far older than that.
Yeah.
Well, something that fascinated me about it is, and I don't think a lot of people think this, is like stone sticks around. So if I find a very good stone tool, be it a vase, a pot, whatever it is, and I'm in a primitive culture, I'm going to use it. And the best example I have of that is I can walk up right to my dad's wall, and he's got a collection of arrowheads. Some of them are perfect. We have no idea how old they are, right? Yeah. But I could literally pull that arrowhead off the wall and put it on an arrow and hunt with it today. It still works, be it 200 years old, 1,000 years old, or we actually live very close to the Gulf site. So we've got some familiarity with, because in your presentation you talked about, there was Clovis first, and now we've basically disproved that. We live close to one of those sites. Up to 20,000-year-old arrowheads around here. It still works today. It's as effective today as it was then, and so I'd be stupid not to use it if I am a less advanced culture, but I find a good tool. Right?
Yeah, 100%. Have you seen that movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy?
Oh, I love that movie with the Coke bottle. Yeah,
the Coke bottle, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like that's the thing to me. So that's the inheritance part of this. I mean, you, like I said, you are, if you're in the Nadak culture and you're making clay pot vessels, which they did. I mean, there's plenty of pottery styles, and Petrie did a whole thing on it too. You find a stone vessel made from granite that's perfect, basically, and it's just, you would like, oh my god, like you have probably played with granite and flint, and you're like, this is bullshit. I'm not spending any time, hammering on this. And then you find something like that. I mean, it's like immediately valuable, usable, useful. And I think it would become valuable. Like this is something that would filter through to the upper echelons of those societies, and then therefore probably be buried with them once that that cultural trait starts to establish itself, which it had for a long time. People would be buried with their their stuff, and that's where we find them today. So yeah, I don't think that means they made them, and that's typically how it works in modern archaeology and Egyptology in particular. Like if it's found at a burial site, if somewhere in that site, if there's a name been scratched into a wall somewhere, then that typically is like, well, okay, this is the guy who obviously had this whole thing made. Therefore all these artifacts belong to him, and they were made for him. It's the equivalent of the cataclysm happening to us, and future archaeologists finding some sort of graffiti on like the Empire State Building and thinking that little Timmy was the guy that built the the Empire State Building. It's nonsense. It's the same thing as like imagine it happens again. Imagine the cataclysm happens. You've got some rich private collector in today's time who has some of these vases that we know are at least 5,000 years old. He gets buried with them. Records go away. Thousands of years pass. They dig up his mausoleum and they find these vases. And this guy that we're going to carbon date must have made these. And now they're misjudging it in the future. I mean, you can't simply go on that sort of information. I think we need to keep an open mind when it comes to some of this and evaluate that evidence for what it means. And that's why I think the vases in a big way are kind of a smoking gun on all of this, because they have this link. We see the same machining tools. It's what Yusuf calls pyramid builder technology, tubular drills. We're working in hard stone. It's precision. We see the same witness marks in these things. They share a lot of these characteristics with a whole category of artifacts that come to us are attributed to a lot of periods of dynastic Egypt, but they just couldn't make them. Like they stopped. If they could make them, then they stopped making them after the first and second, third dynasty, which doesn't make much sense. In fact, what I think actually happened is that they, Imhotep, who's this, not just the villain from the Mummy movies, but he was a polymath, a genius. He was the guy who designed the step pyramid. He worked for Djoser. He was celebrated throughout the dynastic Egyptian civilization, all the way down to the New Kingdom. They knew who he was, and there's stuff dedicated to him. But he's the guy who was credited with coming up with, I think, what was ultimately a method of imitating them. Like, he's the guy who came up with this method of, here's how we're going to grind out these alabaster vessels made from travertine or alabaster, which is like a 2 or a 3, somewhere there on the Mohs scale. And then, thanks to him, we have this incredible trove of these vessels that are built all the way through that Egyptian civilization, and they're beautiful. Like they're wonderful ancient treasures, but they're not precise. They're not the same thing remotely as the hard stone vessels. I mean, some of these things, if you've seen the videos, I mean, some of them are just so perfectly balanced. They sit up like they're sitting on the tip of an egg.
The one that spins just perfectly.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them that spin.
That's crazy.
It really
2 millimeters of wall thickness, translucent.
It really blew me away when you started in the videos, when you started talking about the how precise they were and the fine numbers, because one of my hobbies, it was really my dad's hobby, but I've learned about it over the years, is he hand loads all his ammo, which is something else where you deal with very, very small weights, very precise weights, and to do that stuff requires such high-end, expensive machine work. Now, granted, it's all levers and stuff, but it's super precise and it's super hard to do. And that's with modern metals and tools and stuff. Yeah. And the idea where somebody, and I do a little bit of woodworking, so I know what it's like to try and make a straight line cut or try and do some of that stuff. And when you were talking about people who are like, oh, you would just do this by hand, I'm like, do you have any idea how hard it is to do anything by hand, even with like modern high-end hand tools and stuff?
Soft material, like
soft material like wood or something like that. Do you know how many pieces of wood I've tossed out because I've made a wrong cut and went, and then when you talked about overcuts, because I like hand tool woodworking, but I learned some power tool woodworking, and we use that for like construction and stuff. You see overcuts. That's where you see the circular saw go past and do this, and
that's what it looks like. Yeah,
and if you're doing it by hand, you don't do an overcut. In fact, you're slowing down as you get to whatever the edge of the cut is, so you don't go over, because you've spent hours, weeks, days, months getting to that point. You're not going to screw it up by doing an overcut.
Yeah, I mean that's right, and I think one of the realities I've seen some of the criticism and the skepticism on the Vase Scan Project, and it typically comes from people who just aren't. That none of them are machinists. They're not engineers. They're not metrologists. I mean, if you look at the comments on these videos, and I think the strong reaction that they've garnered, I mean, I just see all the time, like machinists, people that work in these fields, they get it. Like they just get it. They understand what this means, the significance of it, how difficult it is. I think trying to replicate them through a variety of processes is part of the challenge. It's kind of an open challenge out there for people to do. But yeah, it's. I think a lot of people that look at that and go, yeah, you can. It's just time and it's literally, and it is quite literally the answer that you get from Egyptologists. It's like, it's just, you don't understand how dedicated they were, how hard they tried. They just tried really hard. I call it the National Project Bro answer, because that's literally what Zahi Was told me when we asked him about how do you explain the precision and a lot of these aspects of the Great Pyramid. And he said, well, it was a national project. See, they just tried really hard. And it's like explaining the Apollo program as a national project that the whole country was behind, and all we did was come together and collectively throw some people at the moon. No, there was some technology involved. Like, you couldn't have done it without technology. Like, it's the same thing.
The other part of that is, like, modern Egypt, has absolutely no benefit from talking about other things. They have a huge amount of the economy, they have their culture, and everything is wrapped around the idea of what we know as like mainstream Egyptology. That's a big thing, because I've got a little bit of academia background, and mine's all religious based, but
Right.
it's really hard to get a new idea through because there's so much academic inertia, I guess, tied into all of this. Ego, pride, money, books.
There's a
tourism,
lot of that. 100%. And I mean, I don't think that the tourism thing at this point, I've been there a lot. It's just there's two ways of looking at this. I think that there's absolutely an old guard that includes guys that are Egyptologists like Zahi, etc. And they're similar to a lot of the Egyptologist academics worldwide in terms of that they're entrenched in this mainstream story. That said, there's also an undercurrent in Egypt where, and in fact, this is part of what we're doing with the Vase Scan Project now, is we're trying to get, we're working with an Egyptian university who already has access to museums, and it's a team of engineers, machinists, and Egyptologists. They're already scanning stuff for 3D visualization on the screen or whatever. It's not super precise yet, but we want to get them their hands on some structured light scanners and things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it to some extent we are talking about it, and I talked with Chris Dunn a bit about it too. It represents a chance a little bit for the Egyptians to sort of take back a bit of their own history, because the modern story of civilization and the dynastic Egyptian story is really something that's been dictated by Western scholars to them.
Yes,
like it
absolutely.
is typically Europeans, Americans, whatever, that have put that together, and the whole science of Egyptology has come from there. And you definitely have Egyptians that are in that field. But this is something where it's a chance for them to start to rewrite their own history and take it back a little bit. I sometimes wonder. I mean, I think ultimately it's like people ask me, "Oh, are you going to get banned from going to Egypt?" And that I don't. I'm not worried about that in the slightest, because I'm bringing people to Egypt. And the new guys I've actually met. Well, he's since been fired. The guy who was in charge after Zahi of the Department of Antiquities, or the Ministry of Antiquities, he got fired over the snafu that he made around Menkaura's pyramid, saying he was going to put that back together. Eventually lost his job, but I met him, and he's like, bring people to eat. I think there's a little bit more of a willingness to accept, okay, there are groups of people that are coming that are maybe not looking at this from the kind of the mainstream perspective. Obviously, the vast majority of people go there, and that's what you'll get on tours. But if you go there with like me and Yusuf and the Snake Bros, and we're going to show you some of this mystery, and it's intriguing. People will have the time of their lives. It's fascinating, and I think when it's explained in the right context, and you've got guys like Yusuf that can, spend his whole life researching these topics, and he'll show you stuff that just blow your mind. Ultimately, it helps them from a tourism perspective. So I'm hopeful that that'll continue, and I just think it's Egyptology and archaeology in general is like many other sciences in that you have a very firmly entrenched mainstream. There's an old guard attached to that. The same thing happens in climate science. It's all over it's math, physics, all sorts of stuff. These problems are there, and it's almost like a generational process of shifting of the guard. It's like, Planck's constant, right? It's like the science advances one funeral at a time.
Right.
Yeah, these vases. I hope this is hard enough evidence that it can be the equivalent of, the Galt site type stuff to break through that Clovis idea, because I'm a hardcore Gen Xer. I remember the history as it was taught, and some of it is still in there, even though it's no longer even properly academically accepted about some of the histories, but it hasn't filtered into all the books. And, there's a couple of dreams I have around this kind of stuff, is like, we can break through this and at least say, maybe there's something more. Because that's all I'm asking. Like, maybe there's something more. Yeah. And then maybe we can actually scan the desert and see what's still under the sands. I keep waiting for that, that kind of stuff to happen.
I hope the same thing, and I also I've seen there's a slow embrace of new technologies like that. I've actually I know some people with satellite time that work for some tree loader agencies. I work with them, and they've got some interesting techniques for looking inside structures, stuff like that, from space, and we've even discussed like potential areas to go look. And I think that technology is evolving, and my long-term hope is that I hope that archaeology evolves into what I'd call like a much more true multidisciplinary field, because it's typically not right now. I mean, it's like language and cultural arts. And most archaeologists, and Flint Dibbles a good example. I mean, he studies foodways in ancient Greece. They're looking at bones and how people ate and what they ate and what the pattern of, all of this, that type of thing. They're typically not going to be engineers. They're not going to be concerned about engineering evidence. In a lot of cases, you also have this disconnect between other, like genetics, the climate science. Younger Dryas isn't very popular in the archaeological world because, that upsets the apple cart. This idea that, human beings have a much more complex genetic history suggesting Pacific migrations, and there's all this other evidence that comes out, and that just, it doesn't, those guys are very careful to not sort of say what they might think it means in terms of how it might affect that story of history, because now they're playing in someone else's patch. And at the same time, you're not going to find a lot of these, I guess, I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but, it doesn't seem like there's a huge willingness to accept a lot of that new data or deal with it. And I just hope, over time that's starting to shift. I think with the paradigm shift towards the internet, it's almost like there's an end run happening around some of these traditional academic fields. It used to be that the only place you could have these discussions were in these academic halls and in these societies and explorer clubs and all this stuff. But nowadays, it's like a punter like me can get a platform on the internet. And George Howard actually recently had a great way of talking about this on, he was on the Danny Jones show, and he was, he's saying it's like, you're going to have a lot of very bright people from a small pool that are going to filter up to become these academics in these fields, but the internet is drawing from billions of people. So you can't help but have ultimately just a huge overwhelming tide of these sort of didactic, self-taught people that are able to communicate, that are going to filter up and look at, and they're interested in these fields, and they're going to put that data out there. And now that data is available to everyone. So there's like this, you don't really need to go to these academic institutions to have that discussion or to learn about these things. And, I'm hopeful that there's this paradigm shift happening there, that this is becoming more widely talked about. And it's I'm very grateful, as I think all of these creators and people talking about this should be, that guys like Joe Rogan even have an interest in it. And he's been talking to Hancock and Randall Carlson for years, because that's done a lot to popularize it. And ultimately, I think that's the direction it's heading. It's just, I don't know how fast it's going to go. I'm not convinced that this Vase Scan data is going to change too many of the hardcore entrenched academics' minds. I'm not even sure how important ultimately that is, but that certainly they can't argue with the data. I don't think they're going to even, no one's even really tried. Like you can get the scan and measure it yourself if you want. But it's about what it means. And so all of the criticism comes down to, well, those vases are probably fake, or they're just casting doubt on the whole thing. It's nonsense, but that's, people are going to be attached to an idea. It's a lot of, it's like people internalize these sort of discussions and positions that you might have. Like it becomes part of people's, it's like a political affiliation almost. It's like, it just doesn't matter about the data. You're going to defend the position regardless of the data or the fact. And that's what happens, which is also why I think it's personally pointless to go and argue with some of these people. It's just, no one's going to change their mind.
I've had those discussions on, where you get into back and forth with someone on Reddit or on a YouTube comment, and you just reach a point, you're like, this isn't worth my effort. Like, dude, it doesn't matter what I tell you, you're not gonna. But I mean, we had a chat with Danny Hillman the other day about Gunung Padang, and he had the same, he put together all the evidence, and they just turned around and went, yeah, we're just gonna just sort of hand wave all of your stuff away and say you're not, and it's just ridiculous.
It was a travesty what happened with that paper.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd actually swapped some emails with him, and I've been intending to sit down and talk with him too. I've not spoken with him other than on email, but I'm a big fan of what he did and his work. And I think, he's, the fact that paper eventually got retracted just based on this bloody hogwash nonsense, that the only pushback basically in newspapers and The Guardian and whatnot. Just political pressure.
And it felt very much just like,
anonymous
I don't
critique.
agree with you, and I think you're wrong. Like, that's really what it felt like the argument was.
Yeah.
And anonymous critique. You
Yeah, a
know,
lot of
it's
it,
like,
yeah.
so we'll pull it because it's an anonymous critique.
Sources say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't change. It doesn't change the data. I think. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm fascinated to see if they're able to get back in there and get some more data out of that site. But
one day, hopefully. I mean, it's gonna.
Yeah.
It was a regime change that kind of kicked
Right.
him out of there. So maybe it'll take a regime change to get him back in there and somebody that takes an interest. But the departments and the official archaeological groups in Indonesia are all very much against it. So I'm not.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, obviously, what that site needs, Gunung that pyramid in Indonesia, is it needs large scale, proper archaeological excavation. I mean, he was getting
project
set to do that, and that's when he got kicked out.
Yeah.
The problem is if you do that, it may change like the paradigm completely. It's
we can't do that.
And it's like when my background is I have a master's in divinity from Gettysburg Seminary. And it's like when a new manuscript is found. All right, so we got to figure out what it is, where it was written. Was it a fake? Is it real? What does it say? What does it match up with? Because this word changes its entire meaning, and that may make us rewrite an entire book or scripture, or paragraph or whatever. And that can start some fights, and it can get people fired, and it can get people tossed out. And, and even as I've seen students be run out over those kind of ideas.
Yeah. I've been contacted by students in universities that are trying to study archaeology that have had the same story that, they don't do well when they start to question some of the sort of doctrine.
Yeah. The advice we were all given was shut up, get your degree, get your doctorate, and then you can have an opinion.
Yeah.
Only then can you have a new idea or an original idea or an opinion. I remember being like, I can't have an idea. No, you can't have an idea until you've published what we've already told you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I saw you, Johanna sounded like she recorded all of the BAM.
Yep. She did the narration.
Documentaries. What's that?
Yeah, she did the narration. Yeah.
So, the Barabar caves. Just going back to precision again. I assume you've seen those.
Yeah. I've been talking
data on those.
I've been talking to Patrice about them for years. Yeah.
It's just another one of those things where you look at that and just go like, okay, how? And then also then what? Like, what was that? Was it like a meditation space or a healing thing? I remember the first time I showed Bill sort of the 3D renders of the rooms, he went, man, that looks like a nuclear reactor. Like just sort of some of those spaces,
Yeah, those things are amazing. I mean, so people that may not have heard of them, your audience might know about them, but there's these bunch of caves that have been carved out of solid granite, like literally in these granite outcroppings in like a remote part of India. And there's 7 or 8 of them, collectively known as the Barabar Caves. And my friend Patrice Poyard, he runs Jain Films. They did Revelations of the Pyramid or Revelation of the Pyramids. They did Builders of the Ancient Mysteries, Back to BAM. Now they've produced a video on Barabar. They spent a bunch of years studying them, and they've got in there and scanned them with laser scanners. But these things are insane. I mean, they're super precise. That this sheet, it's like modern glass. Like that's how flat the surfaces are in there. In fact, they reflect light like a mirror. It's quite difficult to take measurements and to even take photographs of them because of this like polished layer in there. And they have these really strange geometric features that, in a lot of ways, it's a similar degree of precision to what we see in things like the vases and in aspects of the Serapeum boxes. The huge, like massive sites. I mean, to me, I don't know. It's just like you've got these walls that are meters apart they look vertical, but they're actually turns out they're like 1.5 degree tilted inwards.
Right.
And they're exactly the same on both sides. You've got spherical rooms with like a half sphere dome that's perfect. Very similar to a lot of these artifacts and precision artifacts and objects in Egypt in that they have very primitive writing on them. So on the outside, the story of them, I think it's like 1000 BC or something. I probably get that wrong, but I believe the story is that some ruler, and it's sort of carved, crudely on the outside of the cave, that these caves were given to a bunch of pilgrims as shelter from the monsoon by this particular king. And this was like halfway through his his reign, and it just, people have done the math. It's just not possible that they could have carved these caves in the time that he had up until when he said he was dedicating them or giving them to these people. So it's more likely they were already there, and he's like, "Hey, these are here. You can use them." Nobody knows. I don't know what they're for. They have all these acoustic properties. There's a bunch of acoustic resonance testing done in there. They're quite remarkable. I hope to see them myself one day. I've been talking to Patrice about getting over there and documenting some of it. But yeah, I mean, it's just to me, I think I will probably do some content myself on them based on Patrice's work. I'm working with them. I'm actually putting their videos up on my second channel.
Okay.
And I encourage anyone that hasn't seen it to go out and look for the English version of the Barabar caves. It's absolutely up there with the vases, with the other precision artifacts in Egypt, with a lot of the stuff we see from around the world. It's like nothing else in India either. It's well, that's not quite true either, but they're remarkable.
Yeah, I was gonna say you get into India and parts of China and that part of Asia. There's some weird stuff that just doesn't make sense there. And
there was
the idea.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say the idea that people can't say, well, we should at least say there's a possibility that there were people or advanced technology that we don't understand. There's enough proof to be like, that's a maybe, right? That's at least a maybe now.
Yeah.
Not a straight line. And I think people get wrapped up in this a lot. I think people have this straight line, like we were primitive and technology just advanced in a straight line.
Yeah, that's not how it works either.
As advanced as things are right now, there are still people living in the Stone Age right now on this planet. So it's not a straight line. Not everybody chooses to live this way. Some people come here and they go, you know what? I think that lifestyle is better because I don't have to work 40 hours a week to live in a box and, I can do all this other stuff. So more than one thing could be happening at the same time. You could have the people who are making the clay pots. You could have people working with bronze and someone building like some kind of echo chamber with laser cutters that we don't know how, there's also the question mark. We just haven't figured it out yet because we tend to apply our own technological ideas on what came before. And there's always the X, right? The other. Somebody could have had another at the same time that we had people still just coming into the Bronze Age or coming out of the Stone Age.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is a point. I mean, Hancock's made it well. I make it occasionally as well. It's exactly what you said. It's the fact that, look, I don't dispute, and this was, I sort of had me hopping up and down in my chair a little bit with the Flint Dibble Hancock debate.
Yeah.
When Dibble's like looking at, we found Ice Age sites and all we found are these, Ice Age, basically Pleistocene spear tips and primitive stuff. I'm like, yeah. But that doesn't mean necessarily anything as to what else is going on all around the world. In fact, you can go to the Giza Plateau, and I've done this, and some of these other sites in Egypt, and you can find Neolithic stone points there as well. Does that mean that everything we see in Egypt was built with these Neolithic stone points? It's not what people say. It's just like, okay, there was multiple periods of habitation. And I also don't disagree that there was a lengthy period of time where lots of humanity was in, the old Stone Age, the mid Stone Age, the new Stone Age, and like you said, it's today we have that similar situation going on. The ratios are different. Like there's only a few places in the world that we know of that there's uncontacted tribes and people that are still living very primitively, but and particularly during the the glacial maximum and the Pleistocene. This is entirely possible that there were disparate groups and segments of humanity or people or whoever living at vastly different levels, just like there are today. And I think we see some evidence for this. It's just it gets filtered down through these places that get occupied by successive cultures and civilizations, and they leave their mark, which makes it very complex to then try and decipher when you're looking at it and go, okay, this is. You've got to consider the fact that there's probably thousands and thousands of years of reuse and inheritance and renovation going on, and then also thousands of years of destruction and quarrying where stuff's just getting torn apart for one reason or the other. So yeah, it's I don't, and the other point you made, which I agree with, is the idea that we typically look at all this stuff through that lens of our own technology. Like, so we typically today, and this is one of my bugbears with the modern method is that we do view everything, as a subset of what we're capable of. Like, it's just like, yep, okay, we can explain everything. It has to be this subset of everything that we're capable of because they only did things this way. And it's just, I was a technologist for 20 years, so it's lots of new technologies and integrating new technologies, and it's just, I know that there's going to be more things discovered in the future, like 110 years, 100 years, 1,000 years from now, who knows, which should tell you that there are whole domains of science and technology and things that we can't comprehend because we don't know right now. And
there are domains of technology now that didn't exist 5 years ago.
Oh, exactly. So, it's context.
Yeah.
My favorite analogy is you take a cell phone, whatever. I got one over here. You take a cell phone, you take it back just 50 years, and you show it to somebody. You take it back 30 years. But let's say 1,000 years, and you show it to somebody, and it just looks like a black piece of glass or rock. People don't have the context to understand what it is, but you and I, we couldn't build one or make one, but we can look at it and go, all right, we know what wireless networking is. We know about cellular data. We know about touchscreens and cameras and microphones and the apps and the internet and all these things that make it function, that enable us to look at that and go, well, that's a cell phone. I understand its capabilities. But to somebody that's not from this time, it just looks like a shiny piece of rock. And I think there's a potential that we're looking at some of this stuff from the past and go, well, that's just a bunch of rocks. And it's just we lack the context to fully understand it, which is why it's important, I think, to look at it with an open mind, because ultimately you could only stand to learn something. I think that's just following the evidence.
Because just based on sort of some of the things, looking at like the scoop marks and stuff like that my thought has always been, and there's not really a lot of evidence to back this up, but that maybe it's not electricity, maybe they went with sound, and this is vibrations, and
could be,
it's just a whole different avenue of technology that they could. That's how that's their floating blocks, and
speculation is endless. It could be some molecular science that they could literally separate the molecules in the rock. They could soften it somehow. And there's all sorts of ways you can speculate, and I think some of these ideas are worth investigating. Certainly you get the sense for some of that going on. You look at that, the stonework in Peru. There's no straight lines, but you have these wavy internal joining surfaces between these stones that are just perfect, and they match each other
all the way through.
Granite, all the way through the depth of 2-3 feet of stone.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, and so who knows? But I just, this sort of ironclad adherence to this idea that no, this must have been done because we found the tools that they used, and those were the people that lived here last, or the ones that we dug up. That's who did it, and this is how they did it because these are the tools that we found. It's literally the evidence that it wasn't the tools that were found is in the stonework itself. But they're saying, well, here the stonework, it's just circular argument. It's just they just say, well, no, it's the tools that we found explain the stonework. Well, the evidence that it wasn't the tools that you found is in the stonework, but the tools are here, so that explains the stonework. There's literally this stupid circular argument reasoning that doesn't go anywhere.
That reminds me of, and I'm not remember the name, but the geologist that Randall Carlson talks about, who looked at the channeled scablands, and you can't be right because you can't tell us where the water came from. It's like, well, it doesn't matter where the water came from. This is what the evidence says.
Yeah. That's a great example. J. Harlan Bretz in the 1930s, who was the founder of modern catastrophism to some degree. Because it's funny, there's been this in geology in particular. It used to be all about catastrophism. Like if you go back to what the biblical story, right? It's the Great Flood. And that was how we explained our past. And then, now that you have the age of reason, science starts to emerge. And in particularly in a lot of fields, geology being one of them, they literally had a stated goal in geology for something like 60 years that said, we will basically pay for and publish stuff that shows that gradualism and uniformitarianism, these gentle, erosive, and natural processes that we see occurring during our lifetimes, and the stuff we can observe. If you can explain how these features turned up as a result of those processes, then that's what'll get published. That's because they're trying to get as far away from that sort of biblical catastrophism as possible, and it's this huge overcorrection. And in fact, some of those explanations are still what's taught in geology today, when there's a much more just elegant and simple explanation when you start to wrap in some of this catastrophism, like these single event floods and things like the Younger Dryas, where you have this just mind-bendingly impossible to imagine events that carve those landscapes, and eventually, Brett's won out, but it's a fight that's still going on. I mean, they're now, from his idea of a couple of floods or one flood, it's, the academics are like, well, it was 80 or 90 floods. It was this ice dam kept reforming. There's a whole wealth of problems with those ideas.
Right.
It's something, Randall dives into it in huge depth in his the Cosmographia series, looking at it. It's fascinating, but it's just we're still I look at our whole civilization, and I think we're in the very early days of technology. Like we're just getting started.
Right.
Just getting started.
Well,
and it's the wild west. It's
yes.
There's an idea that I don't remember where I heard it from. I know Bill and I have talked about it. That there's, did we sacrifice Tesla's wireless technology because we went with the microchip? Like, did we make a choice sort of in there that now if we tried to implement that, would it just, would it destroy things?
Well,
yeah.
He and I have talked about this. It's like if we got the free electricity out of the air, it would fry it would screw up most of where the direction we went. Right?
Wi-Fi probably wouldn't work.
Wi-Fi wouldn't work.
Well,
the radio cell signals probably wouldn't work.
Depends what you think that is. I've looked into this too. I'm not convinced he was doing wireless at that Wardenclyffe. I think it was xenic surface waves, and this is like I don't know if you've heard about xenic surface waves and Visive technologies. Okay, so there's a little sidetrack, but it's like that it has to do with the tower that Tesla built at Wardenclyffe.
Right.
Like this domed thing. And this is what he called wireless. And it is wireless, but it's not sending it through the air. In fact, there's a company called Visive Technologies that built a Tesla tower. They built one in Texas. You can still see it. There's pictures of it. If you search Tesla tower in Texas, you'll see it. It's like a modern version. It's like the same dome on top, and it's a big concrete cylinder. And it's using a whole other theory of electromagnetic wave propagation called xenic surface waves. Now, everything we do today has all been based on Hertzian wave theory, right? It's like we need conductors and wires and, unshielded wires or antennas, and that's how we send signals over the air and stuff, line of sight, blah, blah, blah. But xenic surface waves works a little differently, and it was an idea proposed a long time ago, and then the math that was thought to be bunk, the math didn't check out, but then it was reevaluated decades later, and it turns out, okay, it was legitimate. There were some experiments done on a lake where they basically sent signals across the surf. Like it has to. I'm probably going to mess this up, and people that are familiar with it will be mad. But it has to do with the interface between basically the surface and the air. So it uses this surface tension. There's something to do with this surface. They call it a surface wave. And they did these experiments on a lake. They proved it out. And there's this company in Texas, Visive. They built this what they call a global test site, and they from this global test site, they could go anywhere on the planet and stick a receiver into the ground, and they could receive signal and power from this site without wires, no transmission, not line of sight, not over the air, but it's using this surface wave. You could think of the whole planet as like a surface bubble that inflates around the whole planet that sends these signals and power. Now, Visive, funnily enough, the connection with apart from the obvious look of the tower with Tesla, is that Visive was started by a couple of retired naval intelligence generals who were part of the crew, and they worked in naval intelligence, which was part of the group that got a bunch of Tesla's material when he died, and it was all classified. These guys spent the next few decades in the system, and then they came out and they started this company. And I think they took some of that tech that they'd been working on, and they tried to commercialize it. Now, the company went bankrupt. Visive's not in business anymore. I think because this gets back to your original point, they couldn't get past any of the regulation, right? It's like trying to get through that, particularly with power distribution, like regulatory environment's a nightmare. Plus, you have all of this, this established weight. It's like trying to, hey, my car runs on water. It's like, yep, don't get in a hot tub or fly in a small aircraft,
Yeah,
like that type of thing. You have this inertial resistance to these new technologies that are going to potentially revolutionize and completely make obsolete these massive established companies that do things a certain way. But that technology is there; it exists, and to me it's weird. If you told people that this could happen, I use it as an example of technological evolution. Like if you told people that you can just send electricity, like signal and power, or just across the surface wave without wires or anything. They're like, you're just talking nonsense. It's hocus pocus. But once you get down, oh, the science actually exists and it can happen. Now we've got a whole new way of looking at what we're, what we're seeing in front of us. It's like a new context to evaluate the evidence. And I think we're lacking a few of those steps when it comes to some of this, these ancient mysteries. But yeah, the Tesla stuff's fascinating. I don't know. I do think that, I don't know if it would mess up everything that we have today, but for sure it would upset the apple cart in terms of the economic.
Which means it's dead on arrival, right? Right? Yeah. But I pulled up the picture, and I've driven by this many times. And I had no idea that's what that was. Yeah. So,
There's some kid on YouTube I just saw today who's figured out how to try to make diesel out of plastic, and my first thought was like, "Oh, don't get in a car, man! Like,
stay out of hot tubs." Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, these things happen. Well, it's strange. It's a strange old world, man. And it's not. I think these ancient mysteries aren't without their controversies and potential cover-ups either. I mean, there's been a few that I know of that. The labyrinth is one. There's where stuff I think that could potentially be paradigm shifting might just be not really released. There's all sorts of these crazy rumors about sites that they've found. I mean, you got Bob Lazar talking about some of these craft that have come from archaeological digs. I mean, who knows? It's.
Well, then you got the Smithsonian hiding all the giant bones.
Well, there's two things there. There's the potential active conspiracy of the Smithsonian. And then there's the bureaucratic, I just lost it.
Yes.
Conspiracy that we know exists from the government. Like, so much stuff has just been misfiled.
It's in a warehouse with asbestos. And we can't give it to you until we clean it up.
Or we ran out of room, so we went and dumped all the fossils in the East River, the Hudson Bay,
or wherever,
which they've admitted to doing.
They did.
And it's just like,
I got told off by Hugh Newman about when I was like, show me a bone, like what the hell with the giants thing, and then. He educated me a bit, and he's like, well, they literally have evidence. Like they don't have the bones that you can point to, but there's literal actual evidence of the Smithsonian having them. Yeah. There's written evidence of that they had them, and we just don't know where they are now. Like,
we lost it.
We lost it.
It's like somebody, I can't remember who said it, but like the truest scene in cinema is at the end of Indiana Jones, the first one, where they're wheeling the ark into just random.
Yeah. Warehouse 51 or whatever.
Just put it away, and forget it's there. Who's looking at it? Top men, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yep. I was just watching this crazy story about this, like the Dark Pyramid in Alaska or whatever. That's just those guys talking about this stuff. I didn't know anything about it. I was like, oh, this is kind of an interesting little conspiracy tale with all these first-hand accounts of it and stuff. Who knows? Like I've heard rumors, and I know of any number of. There's been any number of secretive digs and stuff done. I mean, I documented a bit of it when I was looking at the Sphinx Temple. This long history where I was digging back through these, Art Bell interviews from the 90s with Boris Said and the Edgar Casey people, and how Zahi's had a relationship with them, and he's been basically for 40 or 50 years been enabling them to go and dig and do whatever they want secretively on the plateau. And there's and there's so many places like that where you go around, you look at these holes in the ground or these big shafts and stuff, and you cannot find documentation on it. Like there's just somebody's probably looked at it, and they've all these sealed doors everywhere. You just can't find that sort of information. So it's just, I don't know. I think it's entirely possible that they've found stuff and it just hasn't. I think that's probably what's going on now in the pyramid. I genuinely believe that. In fact, I'd seen some evidence for it because I go there every 6 months, it seems like. And because they found these other chambers, right? They know they're there. And we finally got to look at that little tiny one that's above the chevrons at the main entrance. But they closed that thing last year for a couple months. And and in fact, the last time I was there, the last couple times I was there, first of all, I saw power cables running up into, what they call the relieving chambers, which are these chambers above the king's chamber. And it's tough to get up in there because the Grand Gallery is like 30 feet tall and it's on this angle, and there's this little hole up in the top left, and you got to crawl through that, and then you can kind of get into these chambers. And then the last time I was there, they actually had the ladder for it, like strapped to the railings in the Grand Gallery. And I was looking at the guard and I was like, hey, bro, can we get this off here and get up there and take it? He's like, no, you can't do that. But they've had power cables running up into there, and that would be the place where they would be drilling probably to look to see if they can get into this chamber, or cutting. I mean, nobody's really been up there for a while, and there's certainly lots of reports. You can dig up some of these stories about people trying to do acoustic tests in the pyramid, only to be interrupted by the sounds of drilling and hammering, and then watching these dudes carrying out burlap bags full of limestone chips where they've been cutting passages to get into stuff, and you just never. It's just not there's no published information on this, so who knows?
What are they hiding? That's the question, man.
Yeah, what are you hiding?
Because it feels like just saying there was people 20,000 years ago doesn't seem like a big enough thing for this big of a cover up. Like, it feels like it's something. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I look, obviously, I think it's potentially way older than that. Some of these mysteries, their origins are potentially tens, hundreds of thousands of years older than that.
Yeah.
I also don't rule out the possibility that it was just us. I mean, the fact is, we're the last humans left. There have been other humans on this planet, like Neanderthal were the most recent ones that we know of. We've recently, I mean, this was new information to me, where they, for the longest time I thought that they had said that, well, Neanderthals they couldn't talk, they couldn't communicate because of their voice box structure, but that's changed recently too. Apparently, they're saying, well, no, they could talk. They do have the vocal box structure for that, beautiful singing voices by all accounts. There's other Denisovans, and we're seeing this complex history, and these guys. A lot of these guys have got bigger brains than us, and they're stronger than us, and there's just who knows if there wasn't a mixed match of other species of humans that may have actually had a hand in developing civilization in the past. I don't know.
And did they really go away? Because that's a whole thing. Like, I've done some of the genetic testing on myself, and I've got a fairly high percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Yep. So now I remember the idea of crossbreeding was the stupid caveman. It would never have happened. Well, some of us are walking around proof. And what amazes me about that is my dad's orthopedic surgeon, because my dad wrecked like 12 motorcycles through his life, told him in the late 80s, early 90s, well, you're a Neanderthal because your bone structure is different.
Yeah.
And we just laughed it off, Well, come to find out, he was right. It's Well, yeah, I mean, this stuff is, and we're finding humans that we have no bone physical evidence of, but we're finding it in the DNA. We're finding it in the genetic code. Oh, here's another hominid.
We barely have bone evidence for some of these other, like Denisovans. It's literally like a pinky we're going off, I think. And then,
or some teeth.
And some teeth, I mean, Lloyd Pye, I'm a fan of Lloyd Pye. I mean, I'm not a Sitchin fan. Like, I'm not a Sitchin. I don't subscribe to the Sitchin theory. And Lloyd Pye definitely takes this sort of hard left turn into Sitchin, but his book and his work, this Everything You Think You Know Is Wrong, is a great book, and he he really lays out an interesting case for human evolution and some of these unknown aspects and potential paths that we've taken to get here, and the possibility that there may well be it covers Bigfoot, all sorts of different stuff that's really interesting. And I just think his work in the DNA and some of the genetic evidence for the weirdness around our own past is compelling, and it's interesting. It's mind-opening, put it that way.
The thing that makes Sitchin a hero for me isn't so much his conclusions, but he's like, one of the things he did is, why don't we look in the back catalog of the British Museum? Why don't we go look and see what's in the back room that we haven't looked at forever? And I think we need to do a lot more of that, because the joke is the only reason the pyramid is in Egypt is the British couldn't move it. Right, otherwise it would have been in the British Museum.
100%. I saw someone said, name something that seems British but isn't British, and it's like, well, the contents of the British Museum.
Yeah. That and the Vatican. We need to break into the Vatican.
God. Yeah, that would be a dream,
and go through their paperwork. Yeah.
I'm sure they have some interesting stuff there. I mean, Father Crespi stories, all the other stuff like I'm sure that the Vatican archives have endlessly interesting documents.
Just
if
the
only
stuff that
we
they've
could read them.
forgotten they have.
Yeah, that's the stuff. It's the things that they don't even remember they have anymore that I would be interested in.
I mean, there's literal proof of this, how this works. I mean, I have one of these very rare, only a few hundred produced of this, like the Sphinx Revealed pamphlet, which was a rediscovery in the archives of Henry Salt's account of Captain Cavillier's first. He was the first kind of modern excavation to happen around the Sphinx, and it's a very interesting. All these diagrams and all this documentation, some of these accounts that are literally thousands of years old from some of these Arabs that were going into the pyramid, and it's this whole account that he had that they had lost for I don't know how long, like decades and decades, and they found it somewhere, and then we'll publish this little pamphlet that shows you what he said, and it's just. Yep, that stuff goes missing, and they forgot they had it, and they eventually found it, and thankfully actually published it.
Well, Ben, I just want to thank you for your time. This was awesome.
Cheers, Daniel. Bill.
Yeah,
man.
So,
it was fun little conversation.
This is
you can talk about this stuff endlessly. I mean,
you can.
Oh yeah, that's what started our podcast. We were like, I wonder if anybody else would be interested in this stuff.
Good. I'm glad.
All right. Well, thank you.
Awesome.